Okay, by my watch, I have 8:02, so I think we can go ahead and get started. We've got a number of people in here. I suspect a few more will come in as we get going. First of all, good morning and welcome to everyone who's with us. This webinar is called Weathering the Storm of Inflation. And we're presenting this webinar to give you some solid, proven strategies and tactics to successfully manage the effect of sustained inflation on your businesses. And I can tell you that these strategies and tactics that we'll be talking about this morning have truly been battle tested in several inflationary cycles in the United States, as well as in some foreign countries, including a couple who have experienced hyperinflation. My name's Warren Mueller. I'm a business coach at the North Idaho College SBDC. I'm in my 6th year at the SBDC following a 30-year international business career, and I am also a small business owner. Now, in terms of what we're going to discuss today, first of all, we'll talk about inflation, what it is, and look at some historical inflation cycles in the US and talk about what the effect has been on businesses. We'll then also talk about how we can go about gathering specific inflation data from something called the Consumer Price Index. Then we'll talk about some of the things that small business owners need to watch for specific to your business, what to be looking for in the news that comes across your desk in terms of inflation. And then the meat and potatoes of this webinar will be specific strategies and tactics that you can use to manage through a cycle of sustained inflation. Following that, we'll follow up with kind of a 50,000-foot view of what your job is ahead in terms of protecting your business from inflation. We'll also talk about some general SBDC resources that are available to help you deal with economic inflation. I certainly encourage everyone to feel free to ask questions throughout the webinar. You can either ask questions out loud and we'll stop and try to answer that question, your question. You can also put those in chat box and those will be monitored and brought up at appropriate times. Also, I want to tell you that you will get a copy of this presentation after the end of the webinar. So let's just jump right in and start talking about the subject of inflation. Now, it's kind of interesting that inflation is really something that we've not talked about in the US business community for the last 10 or 15 years. And we'll discuss why that is. But basically, from a business consulting, business coaching standpoint, inflation really hasn't been anything that we've talked about. But that changed dramatically on May 3rd of this year, when a fellow by the name of Larry Summers, who was the former chief economic advisor in the Obama administration, said during a news interview, "I think there's a real possibility that within the year, we're going to be dealing with the most serious incipient inflation problem that we've faced in the last 40 years. Well, that immediately brought to mind the question, is Larry Summers correct? And so let's take a look at a little bit of data that might shed some light on what he said and why he said it. So here we have a chart that plots the rate of inflation, and that's the blue line. It plots the rate of inflation from 1960 all the way to 2020. And what you can see here is the line hits a maximum right around 1980. And that maximum turned out to be 14.5%. So in 1980, we hit an inflation rate of 14.5%. Now, to give you some context as to what that number means, if you think of the price increases you've seen recently on various things and maybe price increases in your business, those price increases have come from an inflation environment that's running at about 5.4%. So imagine what must be taking place when inflation reaches 14.5%. Well, after that maximum, the inflation rate started to come down over a period of years. And in fact, from the period of about 2005 to 2020, inflation has really varied between 3% and 0%. And so that's why we say for the last 15 years or so, inflation really has not been a factor in our economy and really has been nothing to talk about. Before we leave the chart, we also have plotted on here on the reddish line something called the prime rate. And this is the prime lending rate that major national banks make to their very best loan customers. And as you can see, the prime rate roughly tracks the rate of inflation. And in fact, in 1980, the prime rate peaked at about 21%. And we'll talk about that later and why that number is significant. So that's a little bit of the history of inflation. And that's why Larry Summers said we may be facing the worst problems of inflation that we've seen in the last 40 years, because he's talking about that 1980 number where we hit 14.5%. So that's a little historic perspective, but let's also talk about what is the definition of inflation. And this definition is a pretty good one. Inflation is a general rise in the price level in an economy over a period of time. So individual price increases at businesses are not inflation. It's when you have a general rise in the price level of the whole economy over a period of time. And what happens is when you have that general price rise, each unit of currency, like our dollar, buys fewer goods and fewer services. And so consequently, inflation reflects a reduction in the purchasing power per unit of currency or money. So let's look at an illustration of how significant that loss of purchasing power can be. If you were back in 1960 and you went shopping and you bought $100 worth of goods, some food, maybe some hardware items, maybe some things for the home, some things for the car. If you went out and spent $100 on a basket of goods in 1960, today in 2021, you would have to spend $927.29 to buy that same basket of goods from 1960. And so what that says, or what that means, is our currency, the US dollar, has basically lost 90% of its value in 60 years. To say it differently, if your grandparents had worked and saved to build you a nest egg of, let's say, $10,000, and then had put that in a safe to keep it safe and secure, if you were to take that $10,000 out today, it would only buy $1,000 worth of goods. The average salary in 1960 was about $5,000. So that means that they would have worked and saved for 2 years to get that 10,000, and now today it's only worth $1,000. That's what inflation does to an economy. So how do we go about as business owners finding inflation information that's specific to our particular businesses? Well, the inflation reporting you hear in the general media is typically not very useful. It can be a little bit deceptive and certainly not very informative. A better source of inflation news, particularly as it impacts you in your personal life or in your business, is a source called the Consumer Price Index. And the Consumer Price Index is compiled and it's reported on by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. And that's the link to the BLS website. And when you get this presentation, you'll have that link. And so you can go to the Bureau of Labor Statistics website and you can navigate on their site to find the Consumer Price Index report. And you can click on the latest news release to get the most current Consumer Price Index summary report and detailed reports on various consumer categories. And if you do that, this is what you get. This is the summary report that was put out by the Bureau of Labor Statistics about 2 weeks ago. And so it gives the latest inflation data as of July 2021. And as you can see, first of all, it reports the overall inflation number as of July 2021. And so this is the number we usually see in news releases, whether you're looking at the Wall Street Journal, you're looking at Fox News, you're looking at Bloomberg News, whatever. That's the number that's usually reported for inflation. It's a good number from the standpoint of, say, creating a graph like we looked at a few slides ago to see what overall inflation is over time, but it doesn't tell us very much about the type of inflation we may be experiencing in our personal lives or in our businesses. And so instead of looking at that overall number, we really want to look at various categories of goods and services and what the inflation impact of those are. So, for example, if any of you have bought gasoline in the last 12 months, the inflation rate of gasoline has been about 42%. And if you've bought gasoline, you understand how currency loses value. Because if you have an average vehicle that has, maybe about a 15-gallon gas tank, well, a year and a half ago, it was running you probably about $28 to $30 to completely fill that gas tank. Today, it's running closer to $45 to $50. Same gasoline, same amount, but it costs nearly twice as much money to get that same amount of gasoline. That's the loss in purchasing power of your dollar in terms of buying gasoline. Look at piped in gas. This is the gas that we get from a Vista, etc. The inflation rate is 19%. So I would suspect that somewhere down the road, Avista is going to be asking for a rate increase from the various regulatory agencies that regulate piped gas. Look at used cars and trucks. If any of you have bought a used car or truck for your personal use or for your business, the inflation rate for used vehicles is running at about 42%. And so if you had bought it last year, it would have almost cost you half as much instead of buying it this year. Now, there are some categories where there's some good news. If you've been buying food to cook and eat at home, well, so far food has shown an inflation rate of just 2.6%. Which is lower than the overall reported inflation rate. So that's a good news category. On the other hand, if you use transportation services in your business, maybe to deliver products and all that, your costs for transportation services have probably gone up or will be going up because there has been, as reported, 6.4% of inflation in that category. So this is the summary report that comes from the Consumer Price Index. There are additional reports that you can click on, and you can even dive deeper into various categories to see what their inflation rates are. And so this is a way to get an idea of what the true inflation is that your business is experiencing based on the products and services you buy for your business. Are there any questions about that report?
Can you see wage inflation on a report like this?
Good question. Yes, I think if you dive into some of the more detailed reports, you'll see inflation rate on wages, and I think it's either here or at the Federal Reserve site. You can even see wage inflation by region of the country. I don't remember where that's reported, but yes, it is available. Good question. Any others? Okay. So as we look at the news and we hear what's going on, there are some other general indicators of inflation that just give us an idea of what's happening in the economy. We've all heard about oil prices going up, which of course impacts gasoline and other energy services. Corn prices, soybean prices have been up significantly in the last year. And you might say, well, I don't buy corn and I don't buy soybean for my business, so why do I care? Well, derivative products from those commodities like corn syrup, cornstarch, soybean oil, something called epoxidized soybean oil, those go into a virtually infinite number of end applications, both consumer and industrial. So as those commodities increase in price, that puts inflation pressure throughout most of the economy. Lumber prices, we heard a lot about that this year. They're falling now, but as of last week when I checked, they're still 2 times higher than they were 2 years ago. And in fact, just the other day, I went to Lowe's to buy some wiring for a project in my house, and copper wiring, just wiring for a house, is up about 45%. Housing prices, certainly here in the Coeur d'Alene area, it's been astronomical and shows no indication of coming down. Interest rates on loans have been falling, which helps to finance the housing prices. And long-term bond yields were rising earlier this year, but are falling. And that's significant because bond yields tend to follow interest rates, or actually interest rates follow bond yields. And so bonds are falling right now, which indicates we're probably still going to see falling interest rates for some period of time, which is probably going to help prop up high housing prices. The biggest factor the biggest unknown factor in terms of what's going to happen with inflation is our money supply. Literally, it's the amount of money circulating in the economy. And the money supply over the last 2 years has absolutely exploded because the federal government has spent about has injected $4 to $5 trillion into the economy in the last year and a half via deficit spending, a lot of it to fight COVID after effects and things like that. So big question among economists is, what's going to be the effect of that $4 to $5 trillion just sloshing around through deficit spending and continuing falling interest rates, which in essence give people more money to spend also. The concern is these two things together can create a lot of money in the economy chasing too few goods. And when you have a lot of money chasing too few goods, the effect of that is usually to bid up prices. And so that's part of the reason we believe that used cars, boats, things like that, the prices of those have been bid up because there's a finite supply of those things, but there's almost unlimited money chasing that finite supply. And the reason why all of this is important is this. When commodity prices, like oil, for example, increase, that increase affects virtually every category of the economy. Obviously, transportation, shipping, travel, clothing through synthetic fabrics, consumer products, industrial products, the whole gamut. Pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, building products, all of these derive a lot of their value from oil. And so when oil prices increase, all of those items in the economy increase in price. Oil price increases also drive increases in the cost of agricultural products. So I mentioned corn and soybean and the derivative products that come from those. As those costs go up, those filter through the whole economy also. So between oil and agriculture, it's kind of like a double whammy. And so that's why we're so concerned when we see commodity price increases over a sustained period of time. That tells us those cost increases are going to filter through the whole economy and are going to help drive the inflation rate. Any questions on that? Okay. So all of this is great. It's good to know, but what does it mean for small businesses and small business owners? Well, as we said, inflation has really been nearly non-existent in our economy for the last 15 years. One consequence of that fact is most business owners today have never managed a business during a time of sustained inflation. And so I would venture to guess most or all of you have been in business for 15 years or less. And so you fall into that category. So some of the things that we need to prepare for are, first of all, if we're going to really see a sustained cycle of inflation, and usually that means a multi-year cycle, we're going to need some new skill sets in order to cope with that. And the reason for that is during a cycle of sustained inflation, we're going to have cost increases coming at us from just about every direction. And those cost increases are going to have an impact on the profitability of our business. And so I'd like to take a look at an example to show you what that impact looks like. So let's pretend for a few minutes that we are all the owners of a fictitious business called Panhandle Fabrications and Design. And what we see here is the April 2021 profit and loss statement for our business. And so we've got various revenues. We have several categories of cost of goods sold, raw materials, parts, supplies, direct labor. And then we have the typical overhead expenses you would expect to see in this kind of a business: lease, utilities, office staff, marketing, advertising, etc. And so let's pretend that we're in an inflationary environment. It could be 5%, it could be 10%, whatever. And in that environment, going forward, we're going to see some cost increases. In particular, we could see direct labor increases of 15% over the period of a year. In fact, I would guess right now, some of you have already experienced direct labor increases of that amount, either by paying higher wages, paying signing bonuses, offering benefits, whatever. That's not too unusual. In addition, over the period of a year, this business might see a 9% increase in its raw materials. In the overhead part of the business, we might see utilities go up 10%. And in order to keep our office staff happy, we've got to increase their wages by 6% to try and keep them even with inflation so that their living standard doesn't go down. So in this inflationary environment we're in, we're seeing cost increases in several different categories. And so now let's fast forward to a year later and see what our profit and loss statement looks like. So here we are. Now, one assumption we make here is we're keeping the revenues the same between 2022 and 2021, just to make the illustration easier to understand. Now, that would imply that over the course of the year, we've not increased our unit sales. And I admit that that's kind of an arbitrary thing to do. But the more important thing, and the thing that is very typical in small businesses, is from year to year, we have not increased prices. We've left our prices the same. The impact, though, on costs is significant. Raw materials have gone up because of inflation. Direct labor has gone up because of inflation. Our utilities have gone up because of inflation. Office staff wages have gone up because of inflation. The overall effect of inflation on our business in an environment where we have not increased prices is our gross profit year to year has fallen by 12%. Our net income year to year has fallen by 20%. And so the important message from this is no business, I don't care how well it's run, how profitable it is, how big it is, how small it is, no business can survive with those kinds of profitability losses over time. Because what happens is, as you continue to lose profitability due to the effect of inflation, what happens is your ability to generate enough cash to pay your bills is impacted. And if you can't pay your bills to your suppliers, to your employees, or to your bank, one of those is going to take you out of business. Any questions on that illustration? Okay. So as business owners, what are the kinds of things that we need to be watching out for? Well, obviously, we want to watch out, keep a track of inflation news, and in particular, the consumer price index movements. In terms of news, obviously, the Wall Street Journal is a great source. Fox Business is a great source. Bloomberg Business is also a great source of news. We also want to watch for news about the prime lending rate. This is reported in the Wall Street Journal. And so as the lending rate that major national banks give to their best customers changes, that will be reported in the Wall Street Journal. And if we see prime lending rates going up, that's kind of a preview that lending rates locally, business loans, lines of credit, et cetera, are going to be headed upward also. We can also watch for something called the federal discount rate, for increases in that. This is the rate of interest that the Federal Reserve charges banks when banks borrow money from the Federal Reserve so that they can make loans to people like us. As that rate increases, that's also an early warning indicator that loan rates are going to be going up also. Another thing we should probably watch out for is mortgage rate increases. Even if you're not in the market to buy a house or to buy a business building or anything like that, watching mortgage rates is an important thing, because if those start to move up, and if they start to move up significantly, that's going to have a major impact on the housing markets. And as people buy fewer houses, as they build fewer houses, they need less stuff. They need fewer appliances, fewer carpets, curtains, dishes, anything you can think about that goes into a home, they need less of that. And as that loss in demand filters through the economy, that can have an impact on your businesses also. So given that inflation is here, and given the possibility that it's going to be a sustained cycle of inflation, let's talk about some very, very specific actions that business owners ought to think about taking in order to insulate themselves from the effect of inflation. First of all, you really want to be on the lookout for price increases from your suppliers, whether it's raw materials, whether it's services, whatever. You really want to look out for those price increases. I just had a conversation with a client last week, and we talked about this, and he said, well, I don't really look at invoices and things like that. My accountant does that. And I said, well, you really need to start taking a look at those invoices as they come through, because your accountant may not flag that there are price increases on those invoices. Suppliers don't necessarily let you know that they're increasing prices. They just put it on the invoice, and if you're not watching, you're going to be absorbing cost impacts that you don't know about. Likewise, we need to factor in wage increases into our cost of doing business. This is another discussion I had. Someone, a business owner, had not made the connection between the fact that he's paying somebody more, that's an increased cost of doing business and an impact on his profitability. And so both of those things impact our profitability. And as we saw in the example, we can't let that go without taking some action to mitigate the effect on our profitability. And so the action that we really need to take, and we really need to start getting aggressive about this, is raising prices. And I know this is a very sensitive and sore subject with small business owners. We really don't like to raise prices because we don't want the customer backlash, and we don't want the threats that customers are going to take their business elsewhere or just actually disappear and go somewhere else. But the fact of the matter is, if you start seeing this broad array of cost increases coming from your suppliers, as well as cost increases due to the fact you have to pay higher wages, you have to try and retain your profitability by raising your prices. And so I would submit to you, if you're a little unsure about the process that's involved in successfully raising prices, there's a video out there on YouTube that specifically talks about the process of successfully raising prices. And so when you get this presentation after the webinar, you'll have that link. And if that's an area that you feel unsure about, I would suggest taking a look at that video. Also, another thing that we can do as business owners is to do what's called an 80-20 analysis of customer profitability and product profitability. If we have a portfolio of customers that we do business with over and over, it's nice to know which of those customers actually makes money for us. And so one way to go about doing that or finding that out is to create a graph with profitability on the y-axis and customers on the x-axis. And so we literally take our most profitable customer and we plot how much profit they generate for us, say, in a year. And then our second most profitable customer, and just on and on and on and on and on and on like this. And what you typically find is, in doing this, is that 80% of your net profit comes from about 20% of your customers. And the other 80% of your customers accounts for the final 20% of your profits. And you may find some of your customers are even in negative territory. And with a plot like this, we now need to decide, what are we going to do with these customers who aren't providing much profit to us? One answer to that is we just may need to raise their prices. Instead of a general price increase, a specific price increase to these folks so that they help carry the weight on maintaining our overall profitability. You can do the same thing with products. If you have a portfolio of products, you can plot the profitability of the products in the same way. And very often you'll find the same thing. 20% of your product portfolio generates 80% of your profits. Some of the products you have might even be generating a loss. And you might have to think long and hard, do I want to keep those products in my portfolio? Another thing to think about if we're entering a cycle of sustained inflation is business model pivots. Many of you had to pivot during COVID in order to stay in business. You may have to pivot again as inflation starts to impact your business. For example, if you took on Uber fulfillment or Dash fulfillment for orders to customers, that made tremendous sense during the height of the COVID pandemic. If transportation costs start to go up significantly, that may not be the case. You may have to actually think about pivoting away from those things so that the customers aren't impacted by the cost of that. The basic reason why these things are important gets down to profits. Again, generating profits is equivalent to generating cash, which is equivalent to being able to pay our bills so that we can survive as a business. Any questions on anything on this slide? Okay. let's talk about some other actions that we can be taking. We really ought to take a look at our debt load if we have any, and the type of debt that we have. In particular, if we have any debt that has a variable interest rate, and this would certainly include lines of credit, excuse me, credit card debt, and even possibly some business loans, general business loans that have variable interest rates. If we have any of that variable interest rate debt, we really want to try and pay that down, because typically the interest rate on a variable rate loan is equal to the prime rate plus a factor. So a few weeks ago, I had a discussion with a client, and they were telling me they had just secured a new line of credit, and the interest rate on the line of credit was 4.75%. They said, "That's pretty good, isn't it?" I said, "Yeah, it is." I said, "How is that determined?" And he said, "I have no idea." So we looked at his loan papers, and this is typical. His interest rate is determined by the prime rate, which right now is running at 3.25% plus a factor of 1.5. That's how he got the 4.75 interest rate. I said, "Well, that's really good." I said, "But how would you feel if the prime rate went up to 21%? And he said, "Could that happen?" And I said, "Well, I don't know, but it happened once before. And if it happened again, now your line of credit interest rate would be 22.5%. I would submit to you, for some businesses, trying to service that loan could sink them, and it has in the past. So I would take a look at variable interest rate debt and see how much it is, see how the interest rate is computed, and think about paying down some of that debt if you can. Another very, very, very important one for people who sell on terms. If you give your customers terms like net 30 days, net 45 days, or something like that, you absolutely, absolutely need to monitor your slow paying customers and your non-paying customers. And the idea here is you want them to be absolutely current with whatever their payment terms are. And so we need to get aggressive about demanding payment. If you're net 30, you got to pay net 30. If they will not come up to the terms that you've set for them, one of the things you can do is demand cash in advance for future orders. And if they won't accept cash in advance, you might want to think about, well, not think about, you might want to absolutely cut them off for future orders. And the reason for this is, and as inflation gets worse, this problem gets worse with slow pay and non-pay customers. And the reason you want to take these actions and be aggressive about it is your slow pay customers and your non-paying customers will have the highest probability of all of your customers for declaring bankruptcy. And if they declare bankruptcy, they're not going to tell you. You're either going to hear about it from the courts, or you're going to hear about it from a law firm, or you're going to hear about it from a county sheriff, wherever they're located. And when you hear about that, you can assume that you're never, ever going to see one penny of what they owe you. And I can attest to that because in the mid 1990s, we had a cycle of inflation in this country. And I had one customer in a business I was in that had transitioned from slow pay to no pay, but was still placing orders. We cut that customer off. They screamed and yelled to high heaven, but we cut them off. And we cut that customer off on a Friday. And on a Monday, I got a call from a sheriff in a county in another state telling me that that customer had declared bankruptcy and that some of our product that they had in a warehouse was now locked up, couldn't be retrieved until the court decided the bankruptcy case. Eventually, that was settled and we did not get the product back. And that plus outstanding bills from the customers added up to $60,000. $60,000 that we lost, or I should accurately say $60,000 I lost. And so I don't want that to happen to any of you. Any questions on that slide? Okay. So there's even some other actions that we can think about taking. In particular, it would be good to look at your inventories of raw materials, inventories if you're a manufacturer of work in process, and then inventories of finished goods. That could be a manufacturer, it could be a retailer. All of these categories of inventory tie up your free cash. And so we want to make sure that we haven't overbought raw materials, that we're not manufacturing more products than people are buying, and that we're not letting the finished good inventory rise, because that's tying up our cash, and we might need that cash for other things like paying bills. And you don't want to get into the situation where you're liquidating inventory to try to raise cash, because liquidators pay you 10 cents on the dollar, and that's a really tough way to raise cash to pay off creditors or suppliers or pay wages. Likewise, another reason for watching our inventories is so that we don't get caught with excess inventory if customer demand dries up. I talked about rising mortgage rates earlier. If mortgage rates really tick up several interest points, housing demand could really dive, and that just ripples through the whole economy. And people who might have variable rate mortgages might lose purchasing power. And all that to say is sales demand for your goods and services may go down, and you don't want to get caught with excess inventory in that environment, because again, your free cash is tied up in that inventory. And all that to say, now might also be a good time to implement an inventory control system via inventory software to help manage your inventory and to prevent excess inventory, and also to prevent stockouts when customers can't find what you're selling. And it just turns out that we have some folks with the SBDC who can in fact help you with that. And I would encourage you to contact us if that's of interest to you. Any questions on inventory? All righty. And so here's another action to consider. And that would be to be prepared to match competitor price increases. Now that typically seems counterintuitive, because we like our competitors to increase prices because we're hoping that their customers will then come to us. But in inflationary times, we need to turn that around and think differently, because when a competitor increases their price, they're probably doing it because they're feeling the same cost pressures that you are. And so if they increase their price, you can match that, and that helps to relieve some of that cost pressure on you without really any fear of your customers going anywhere else because the competitor has raised his price also. And so in inflationary times, actually competitors matching price increases kind of helps everyone. And in inflationary times where you have supply chain disruptions, things like that, you may not want your competitor going out of business and all of his customers coming to you, because in fact, you may not be able to serve them and your own customers equally well. And so it can actually negatively impact you if that were to occur. So competitors matching other competitors' price increases in inflationary times is kind of good for everyone, because it shows your competitors that what you're trying to do is to protect your profits, and you're not trying to poach their customers by holding a lower price. And another reason why that's important is that someday it may turn out that you're going to be the one who leads a price increase in your particular market sector. And if you have supported your competitors in the past, they're more likely to support you in the future. Any questions on that point? All righty. So let's kind of look at this now more from the 50,000 foot view. Everything we've talked about up to this point, all the strategies and tactics and actions to take, really is all about focusing on maintaining maximum profitability. Because if inflation ticks up over 5.4, hello? Okay, if inflation continues to increase, getting behind on the profit curve can literally be fatal. If you don't focus on maintaining profitability, typically through price increases, you can get to the point where you've lost so much profitability that it's virtually impossible to increase prices fast enough and high enough to make up for that. And that's where businesses end up going out of business, because they can't generate enough cash to pay their bills. Another thing to think about in inflationary times is looking at developing secondary sources of supply for key supplies and key raw materials that you absolutely can't do without. And there's two key reasons for this. During inflationary times, supply chain disruptions are common, and particularly on imports. If you're importing from China, if you're importing from Europe, anywhere else, supply chain disruptions on imports can be a key issue. I've got a client battling that right now. And so having a secondary source of supply can give you some protection against those disruptions. Likewise, it's possible to have a supplier, a key supplier, declare bankruptcy. And you're not going to know about that until you send in the next order and you don't hear anything. And so for key supplies, key raw materials, having a secondary source of supply makes a lot of sense. The other thing from a 50,000 foot view is that everything we've talked about this morning is exactly what you need to be doing in order to prepare you for the absolute worst case scenario, which is the situation where we have inflation plus recession. If you can think back to that graph we looked at in the beginning, where we plotted inflation over a number of years, we said that inflation peaked at 14.5% in 1980, and then it started to go down. Well, it took about 3 years for it to get back down to 5%. And the reason why it declined the way it did is that the country was in a significant recession at that time. And so what that looks like is an environment of where your costs are still going up. They're not going up as fast as they used to, but they're still going up. But demand for your products and services is going down due to the recession. So your situation is your costs are going up. You have no pricing power because of falling demand. You and your competitors may be cutting prices to try to get customers into your store. And so that's a real squeeze. And it's a period of time where you might be losing money. So having protected profits through price increases and other strategies and tactics puts you in a strong position to survive during that worst case scenario. The absolute worst industry to be in during an inflation recessionary environment is the airline industry. The airline industry is a very capital intensive industry. It's also dependent on fuel costs and on wage costs. And so in this environment, airlines are cutting prices like crazy, trying to get passengers into seats. And in those environments, the airlines lose billions of dollars a year. I don't know. I don't see how executives manage to stay in that industry. Anyway, if we're in a sustained inflation environment, it's very possible the backside of that inflationary environment is inflation and recession. So everything we've talked about today helps get you prepared to weather that. Any questions on that? Okay. So kind of start to wrap this up. The SBDC is here to help. One way we help is through webinars like this. I would encourage you to keep track of those and watch the ones that are of interest to you. We offer one-on-one business coaching at no cost to you. We also have folks on staff that can help you with digital marketing to improve your messaging, improve the targeting of your marketing to those customers that have the most value for your products and services. We have folks who can help with e-commerce and inventory management. And one of the key things we're about is leadership development, helping business owners make good leadership decisions for their business. And we can also help with strategic pricing management to help ensure that you're being rewarded for the value that you deliver to your customers. If you're interested in any of this help, you can contact us through that website. In addition, if you have any questions on the content of this webinar, I heartily invite you to email me at that email address. When you get this presentation, you'll have that. And please, if you have any questions on the content, feel free to email me and I'll do what I can to answer your questions. Any questions before we sign off? Okay, well, it's been nice to be with you this morning. I wish you the best of luck. And again, if you have any questions on what we've covered, if you need any of our SBD services, please feel free to contact us. And I wish you a good rest of the day. Goodbye now.